Okay, good morning. We're going to talk about the aftermath of the Battle of Saratoga because it's typically in histories of the American Revolution called a turning point. And it's a turning point for one singular important reason, and that is it convinces the French that the nascent American nation may be able to win its independence, or more importantly, the French are going to side with the United States and fight until their independence is achieved. It changes the course of the war. And that's important. It changes how England's going to fight the war, as we'll get into more. It makes 1778 really the fourth year of the conflict very significant for Great Britain, and will cause them yet another shift in how they're going to make the American rebellion part of an overall strategy, because with France in, it's going to change the setting, obviously, quite a bit. It's also going to change the landscape of diplomacy, meaning the bargaining leverage by which Franklin and the negotiating team will be able to convince the French leadership and the king and the French people to embrace the American rebellion. I said last time, and I'll just repeat it, the idea that the French are taking something of a risk. I mean, to support a colonial rebellion, which is an anti-monarchy rebellion, is not something the French should do lightly, or the French king. And you can connect the dots, obviously, with the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution. I mean, their money bankrolls the American rebellion and probably accelerates a process by which the French Revolution will begin not long after the American Revolution ends. As we know, it's a very different revolution from the American Revolution. If you like enemies of the state paraded up and beheaded with the guillotine, that's more your speed for a revolution. We often compare it, the American Revolution, to the French Revolution, when a lot of people want to say, well, it's not very radical, the American Revolution. So if you want to compare it to the Russian Revolution or to the Chinese Revolution, to the Haitian Revolution, obviously, very significant and influenced by the American Revolution, maybe it doesn't hold its own. So we're going to get back to that, obviously, in the end. But again, it ties the two nations together. The news of the victory reaches Europe. Now, we know that the battles happened over a couple of weeks, September and early October 1777. News reaches Europe in December about the victory at Saratoga, and that's when Franklin decides to accelerate efforts to make the treaty a reality. He also continues to hammer to his French counterparts the idea of what if the colonies had actually reconciled with England, which the English are still trying to do. It's still a possibility, even in 1778, and the British are hoping for that. I think there's a realization, certainly with Washington, and I think it happens after the battles in 1778, that now it's playing the long game. We're going to have to continue to fight until the British people and the British leadership just see that there's no way in the world they're going to win. They're going to successfully, militarily, and you might say, just defeat the will of the American people to continue to fight. The British march into Philadelphia in 1777. They capture yet another major American city, and the rebellion continues, because I think the British realize too late what Washington is beginning to know more and more, that the army is the rebellion, not necessarily Congress, which is on the run. They escape being captured in Philadelphia. Not the capture of the cities. They just have to defeat the army. And if the army stays around, there's still a will to fight. The revolution will continue. So what Franklin and company tell Comte de Vergennes, the French ambassador, minister, man close to the king, that a French alliance will prevent that scenario, the reconciliation between the American colonies and Great Britain, from happening. And that would be a good thing. It would weaken England around the world to lose these colonies. There is, of course, a lot of distrust with the designs that the French may have. Are we going to have to trade them land in North America for their alliance? How will the balance of power? I mean, certainly it's great to knock England down and win our independence, but will it mean trading and making the French more significant in North America, or reclaiming land in North America. This is the unknown as this group talks. And the talks, as I said last time, start from the very beginning. I mean, the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress are very much seeking to get some type of foreign aid from different countries. The other game changer for the chances of an American alliance and what that would mean for the United States is that the French Navy is nearly done with a retooling and rebuilding of their fleet. Now, it's usually argued that the British Royal Navy is the best in the world, but the French Navy isn't all that bad either. There is no fear in Great Britain that an American Continental Navy is going to frighten anyone or threaten the English islands. The French Navy is a whole other story, however. And this is where they have to rethink the strategy. And Franklin also continues to shrewdly appeal to the French public opinion. Again, wearing the coonskin cap and going out there and, again, reminding everyone about the simple, humble origins and the innocence of the Americans, and how their cause is noble. So finally, at the end of 1777, the two nations do sign the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. I have a slide of that, not only the treaty, but also the important act of Franklin going and signing the treaty. Here we go. There we go, the Americans and the French right there. And this is in French and English what the treaty actually looks like. You know, Franklin signs the three founding documents, right? He signs the Declaration, he signs the, he signs this alliance, he signs the Treaty of Paris also. Maybe you can say four, and then the Constitution. But the three founding documents, there's only one person who has that designation: the Declaration, the 1783 Treaty of Paris, and the 1787 Constitution, and that is Franklin. I mean, talk about a guy being at the right place at the right time. So it is first called a Treaty of Amity and Commerce, meaning a recognition of the independence of the United States, equivalent of what we would call today a most favored nation status among the two nations. And they also signed, more importantly, a Treaty of Alliance. That binds the two nations together in the war against Great Britain. France is going to fight with the United States, not sign a separate treaty with Great Britain when things don't look great, and they don't look great for periods of the rest of this conflict. The French have ample opportunity to back out, but they, to their everlasting credit, remain a loyal ally, if not a sometimes frustrating ally, of the United States. So now we have both the prospect of more financial aid and the ability to rescue the economy from the English blockade, because the French Navy is coming, hopefully. What does it mean for England? Well, it's dramatically bad news for them. A civil conflict with their colonies is now an international war. There's more and more at stake when France enters the contest. It isn't simply, all right, end the American rebellion, and here are the requirements by which the colonies have to re-enter the English Empire, turn over the traitors, execution, whatever the English had planned if they actually had been able to pacify the American colonies. That's part of the goal now. The other goal is, oh no, the French are on the side of our former colonies. For England, their whole colonial overseas empire is now possibly jeopardized. The entire operation, the entire colonial enterprise from the Caribbean to India could be threatened by the French. They don't feel threatened by the United States. There's no impending invasion by the Continental Navy to the English islands in 1778, not at all. Also, it makes the struggle in North America more urgent. And this, but also we have to cast our eye around the rest of the world. They have to prosecute the war with the colonies and fight it differently. English wartime strategies are going to have to, by the French alliance, change. It's transitioning the American war from simply a colonial rebellion and a British Civil War, or a secession, we might say, of the American colonies, to a global war that will stretch the resources of Great Britain for a number of years. Again, the alliance is a game changer. Could the United States have won the rebellion without France? Possibly. Say a head shaking. Maybe. Yeah, who knows? It's one of those. I know it would have been more difficult. It would have taken longer.
And by them joining the sides with us, it helped the other countries start to recognize the colonies as being independent too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So if they wouldn't have joined, then we would have just been on our own.
Because who goes with France if France goes with the colonies? What other nation?
Spain.
Yeah, possibly Spain. The alliance of the marriages, the Bourbon family. We know Catherine the Great in Russia tried to engineer a peaceful settlement between the United States and Great Britain.
And then what if the Habsburgs
Sure.
came on the side with France and hurry on for that? Or was this when she was she's queen at this point?
Oh dear. This is my king's in England. This is Louis the 16th.
Yeah, so she.
It would be the next king, right? Louis the 17th. Yeah, or
No, it was
the same.
thing.
Okay. I mean, yeah, exactly. Now the French have faith in the American cause. The Dutch will lend us more money. That's what John Adams is doing for part of the end of the rebellion, so that if we are successful and win independence, we'll have loans to float and survive. Yeah, that transition from being part of the English Empire to being the new poor, weak United States. So absolutely. This is why this is important. Okay, so switching gears from talking about the importance of the French alliance to the military situation. We're going to go back and forth. Obviously, there is the drum and fife narrative of the battles. Obviously, we're not going through all of them, but the military conflict is significant after independence. The divide between the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War. The American Revolution is continuing to happen, as we're going to find out, and that's in the process of constitution making at the state level and also at the national level. So let's go back and pull up a slide. We'll go back and forth as we usually do. So I wanted to show you the encampment that Washington takes his army into after 1777, the unsuccessful battles by which he tried to keep the British out of Philadelphia in the fall of 1777. Washington takes his army, again, that fought better that year than they did in 1776. This is Trego's painting. I have this in a much larger, this is a slide. I have the copy of the painting in my office. It's hokey and patriotic, I know. And if you look closely, the gentleman kind of just off to the right here has his tricorn hat off in a salute to the officers, one of whom, of course, is George Washington. Valley Forge is, of course, surrounded in some mythology. The other popular image in American history is Washington kneeling to pray at Valley Forge. And of course, the people who are just sticklers for detail, well, we don't know if he prayed at Valley Forge. We don't know if he kneeled or saw him kneel. Again, you have to understand that throughout our history, we concoct these images because at different times we want to, celebrate the past. We want to identify ourselves differently, especially during things like the Cold War. Sometimes, or to rally the national psyche, like during the Great Depression. So here, again, you go to Valley Forge, you go to the stores around it in Pennsylvania, you'll see that famous Washington in full uniform, kneeling and praying. This painting is, again, something that probably along the lines happened where the army was marching at some point in snow. There's the story of the bloody footprints leaving tracks. That happened in the Trenton campaign in 1776. It possibly happened here in Valley Forge. But again, it's just spirits were low because while the Army didn't do what it was supposed to do, which is keep the British out of Philadelphia, it afforded itself a lot better. And I think Washington made a couple of decisions after the 1777 campaign. Remember, we talked about the three options he had. Just go out and fight the British, go disappear into the mountains, or fight that war of posts, as we call it. Washington adopted, I think, more after 1777, a strategy that the historians have called the Fabian strategy. It's for the general in Roman history who retreated and fought the Carthaginians when he just had to pick and choose where he wanted to fight. It's called the Fabian strategy. And Washington is a fighter by nature, but I think after this campaign in 1777, he says, I'm going to just go out there and beat up the British where I can, because there's a realization that his army is not the equal of the British army. And the second realization he comes to is, they don't have to be. They have to exist. And Valley Forge will really cement that. It's one of those experiences that the officers and the soldiers who live through it come out on the other side if they survive, and kind of it's like a badge of honor. If they had like campaign ribbons back then, they would have probably all worn a badge of honor, like, hey, we survived this encampment, which was horrible. Not because the weather was particularly bad. We're going to get into the reasons why the Valley Forge encampment was pretty awful. But it's an army that he takes into the encampment that's stronger than it was the year before. I told you about the makeup of the army. It wasn't the people who were just rah, rah, rah patriotic in 1775 and 1776. We said those folks went home. It's folks who are enlisting in the army for a land bounty, for some kind of bonus paid by either the Congress or by their respective state, or with few other prospects back home. Landless sons, indentured servants, African Americans who are, again, enlisting in the cause because they meet the bounty, they meet the quota set up by the different states. Washington and Congress kind of say, you decide whether or not we're going to have black troops. And Congress says no, and then Washington says maybe, and then Congress says you decide, and Washington says, okay, fine by me. And so that's the makeup of the Army, very much changing. Yeah, go ahead.
With like the American Army, unlike the British, they were fighting for a cause. That's where the British were just, they paid for their titles in the Army.
And the officers, yeah. Yes, yeah.
So, they didn't really have that much.
Well, that's what people say in the Army. The officers, when we have collections of sermons in the American Revolution, and that's what you hear, a common theme. I mean, these are just soldiers. The soldiers are paid to go and kill you, those who are trying to become independent. Washington would always say the cause. I mean, we have a cause which makes the Army unique. And yeah, that's something too. There are patriotic reasons to enlist and stay in an army, because it's not fun. I mean, it's pretty awful. This winter is pretty awful. And those who are the members of the Army look around, and the officer corps look around and say, it could have been better, but the good citizens of America who are supposed to be supporting us aren't. And that's why there is a collective, I think, attitude when they leave the encampment at Valley Forge that we are the revolution. And he has enough of the soldiers, a core of an army, that you can supplement it with new recruits. And the new recruits kind of come in and they adopt what the older recruits, the veterans, had thought of their mentality. Look, I'm doing this for the right reasons because my neighbors did it. That was what I talked about last time, where you had whole communities come out, and the pressure to come out was obviously tremendous. But to stay was a whole nother matter. I mean, the encampments were tough. Army life discipline is Washington says discipline is the soul of an army. If you don't have it, you have just a bunch of guys on a glorified camping trip with guns. So yeah, you can't underestimate that. We've tried to get the motives in all of our conflicts. We try to get the motives for the soldiers who enlist voluntarily. or again, don't, are drafted. And some are drafted and say, look, I'm here and, going to get this over with as fast as possible. But everyone has their own reasons. But luckily, there were enough who continue for whatever reasons they were to keep the Army going. This is a recreation of some of the cabins. I showed you last time the cabins in Morristown. These are the ones in Valley Forge. Valley Forge was chosen because it's near Pennsylvania. It's near Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. It is 18 miles northwest of Philadelphia. That's where the British Army is. So Washington doesn't feel threatened enough by the British Army that he has to just head for the central Pennsylvania over the Allegheny Mountains. Not at all. Valley Forge could be defended, and he felt confident about that. It is also out of the way, and it is in a land of plenty. It's called Valley Forge because it's in a valley west of the city, and also there were a lot of iron forges there in that region. But Pennsylvania is a colony, that state now, that there's a belief that it will be able to sustain the Continental Army. This is one of the three, what they call the breadbasket colonies in North America: New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania. It's a moderate climate. It's not the North, New England. It's not the South. It's somewhere in between. And more importantly, it's going to be able to feed and sustain this army. They arrive in Valley Forge without any food stores in a pretty barren country. So it wasn't as sustainable as they thought, and they had to survive on their own. Washington observed in some of his letters, he takes on a lot more responsibilities than anyone who's a general in command of an army. The day-to-day logistics that he deals with, no general would want to deal with. He would want to obviously hand that off to someone else. Washington observed that there's no soap in the army, which is kind of scary. You have to keep the army clean, but he also concluded that's okay because most men don't have a spare shirt to wash and change into after they actually took something along the lines of a bath. They built these huts right away. And to incentivize building the huts, officers had to sleep in tents until the soldiers had all their huts built. So you would absolutely encourage them to build these as quickly as possible. This is the inside of one of them. They all housed 12 men. They're a 14 by 16 cabin. This is about half. Obviously, it's got 6 bunks. You'd see another half with another 6. And no officer could move into any kind of other quarters. The officers had distinctly different quarters than the actual enlisted men until they were all done. So let me make sure. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's see here. I want to make sure everyone is seeing this. Oh, darn it. Okay. Let's open the share tray again. There we go. Okay. Okay, there we go. Again, these are recreations because they're wood, because they don't last 200 years. But there they are. Washington lives in a tent, just like his officers, until his troops are in these rough log cabins. And he puts himself into a fairly crowded house with his staff right here. This is Washington's headquarters at Valley Forge. He had a nice house in Morristown too, the Ford Mansion, which is still there. This is, again, where he would have the upstairs, and the downstairs would be devoted to, again, meetings and having his officers there and planning any kind of strategy that he had to. The legend of the suffering at the Valley Forge encampment is because of the quartermaster department, as it is called. That is the supply of the Continental Army. And in a word, it is a mess, an absolute mess. The quartermaster department is tied in with the commissary, which provided food. And unfortunately for the Army, it's always a changing staff with people of, let's just say, not always high quality in charge. You can imagine that they're junior and those who it's really made folks frustrated in the Army. It's supposed to be a land of plenty. Unfortunately, most of the farmers in eastern Pennsylvania refuse to accept worthless continental currency. Here's payment for your grain. for the cattle that we're going to slaughter, for your flour, for anything else we need. And you can imagine that these citizens of North America weren't all that happy about getting paper money that wasn't even worth the amount that it promised on there. They'd rather, of course, take gold and silver from the British Army. And their army wasn't too far away, of course, either, inside Philadelphia. So the good people of North America sent their produce, cattle, and grain to Philadelphia, where the British paid for it. It's more proof to Washington and Congress that they were witnessing a decay in the public virtue by 1778. Okay, I'll leave it in the slideshow because I'm going to talk about some of the other folks who arrive in the actual encampment. You know, that convinces Washington. Basically says to his officers who go out and forage, you know, you go out with wagons and you go out, of course, armed, because you always want to be armed when you go out there in case you run into any unhappy loyalist or, God forbid, elements of the British Army. Please plunder and pillage in a polite manner. You know, hand the people money, but tell them, look, we have to take this. If they're not happy about it, say, look, this wasn't a question. We're going to take what we need for the army, and we're going to give you this money that isn't worth anything. And, you know, there we go. Thank you for your support of the Continental Army. And folks in Pennsylvania, you can imagine, weren't all that happy. At Valley Forge, 2 men from a smattering of officers from foreign countries prove their worth. Now, there's a group of people around the world that, of course, when there's a war, they will sell their services to whatever country is fighting. They're sometimes called mercenaries. Captain John Smith of Jamestown did that. I mean, this is a guy who said, if England isn't at war with anybody, I'll find a country that is at war with somebody and I'll join up. But they did it for various reasons, for pay, to maybe inflate their own abilities. Certainly what the second gentleman we're going to talk about did. Not so much this youngster, who was a college-age teenager, really, 18, 19 years old. His name is, wait for it, everybody. Okay, his name's Lafayette. The Marquis de Lafayette. His name is Marie-Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert du Motier. That'll be on the exam, by the way, just kidding. Marie-Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert de Motier. He is from French lineage that goes back centuries. He is the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette for short. There he is. He is enamored with the American cause and the American Revolution. This is a not old enough to be cynical, wide-eyed youngster who comes over to the United States basically by sneaking out of France. The king prohibits him from going there. When you're a teenager, as you know, when your authority figures tell you not to do something, your first response and impulse is to do that exact thing they tell you not to do. He serves without pay in the American cause, simply volunteering his services. Now, this is the thing about I want to tell you about these foreign officers and adventurers who come over. They present their credentials and letters, which sometimes are falsified, and everyone in Congress, oh, wow, because, you know, we have to cobble together an army of folks who may have had some experience as colonial militia, may have had some experience in the French and Indian War, or in the case of Charles Lee and Horatio Gates, they had actually been officers in Washington in the British Army. Washington never had an official rank in the British Army. Lee and Gates did. So then you have these folks come over. Thaddeus Kosciuszko from what's now Poland, an engineer, instrumental in helping the American campaign in the South. So some were good, some were not good. They were given ranks. You can obviously understand that they were promoted on the spot or given the, I'm the equivalent of this rank in the country I come from. And everyone's like, that's great. And then the Americans, like Benedict Arnold, who never think he's getting promoted quickly enough and sees people who are not as skilled and talented as he is promoted. And that just really chaps their britches, as the expression goes. That's one of the reasons why Arnold will leave the Continental Army and switch sides. Anyway, Lafayette. The bright-eyed enthusiasm for the cause. He says, and here's a quote from Lafayette, "The welfare of America is intimately bound up with the happiness of humanity. She is going to become a cherished and safe refuge of virtue, of good character, of tolerance, of equality, and of peaceful liberty," unquote. No pressure, right? That's what he thinks the United States will become if we are successful. He's wounded in the Philadelphia campaign, shot in the leg at the Battle of Brandywine, September 1777. Washington, who has no children of his own. You might hear that Washington has a son and daughter. They are the children of his wife's first marriage. Washington is the father of his country, who doesn't have any of his own children. I don't want to get into Washington's personal history all that much, but there's a pretty good chance he's sterile, we think. Because people like to have this impression, oh, it was just a relationship of convenience, Martha and George. That's not true at all. I mean, or she's this kind of frumpy widow who he just happens to, we've done research, and much like sorry?
He cheated on Martha numerous times, if I've heard correctly.
I'm not aware, but it could be possible. It's possible, but that's not a story that I don't think is entered into the general knowledge. I mean, again, I don't know everything about the guy. I do know that, what's that?
I'm thinking of Benjamin Franklin.
Oh, yes, he had a son out of wedlock. His again, illegitimate son becomes the governor of New Jersey.
That's cool.
Yes, William Franklin. And they have a falling out over taking sides. William is a staunch loyalist for the rest of his life. The Patriots arrest him. And Benjamin, they have it out. They have this discussion, and they're up late at night, probably having a few drinks, each trying to basically argue their side, for independence against. And when he's arrested, William, we know that Benjamin doesn't lift a finger to help he had more influence than maybe anyone to get him released, and doesn't. You picked the wrong side. Yeah. Oh yeah. Benjamin Franklin. Yeah. He was a ladies' man.
Way more kids than he knew about. I feel like that wasn't his only kid.
That's entirely possible. Yeah. But as far as Washington, we people have done a lot recently to make him more human. And I showed you that slide of him where he looked when he was that surveyor, 20, 21 years old. They've done the same finally with Martha Washington. And the response was, whoa. I mean, this is, we don't have paintings or images of her when she was about the age when she married George. And now we're like, wow. I mean, she's not, this kind of just widow, who's got a lot of money and a couple of kids. And, here comes dashing George Washington along. For all intents and purposes, it was a very passionate marriage. We just don't know the details because, as I told you before, they destroyed all the letters basically between the two of them. Washington said, that's not anything that posterity will ever be able to get from me. You can get all the letters that I wrote as a general and a politician, as a president and all that. So going back to where Lafayette fits in here is that he's basically an adopted son. Anyone who is young enough to be Washington's son, Hamilton comes into his circle too. Hamilton shows his medal at the Battle of Trenton. And look at his background. He's basically, John Adams will later say about Alexander Hamilton, he's the Creole bastard brat of a Scottish peddler. Now, that all basically is true. He was born in the Caribbean. Creole meaning he had parents who were not born in the American colonies. His parents were not apparently married when he was born. Whether or not he's a brat or not is arguable. And his father was a ne'er-do-well. And he moves to New York as a teenager, does Hamilton. And, Washington basically has a lot of respect for people who come from not a strong military background or just proves themselves by how they operate. Henry Knox, he's leaning more and more on Nathaniel Greene, especially at the end of the Valley Forge encampment. Nathaniel Greene, we're going to talk about in the Southern campaign, but Greene is a Quaker with a bad leg. And Greene used to go to Henry Knox's Boston bookshop and read books on, how to be a general. I mean, how to command soldiers. So they're self-taught in an army where you have to have men of ability who are self-taught and self-educated in many ways. And that's why, and Hamilton is just great at being Washington's kind of, we would call him a military secretary or administrative assistant. Hamilton's the guy who screens people coming in and kind of a gatekeeper. He can write very well and writes a lot of the letters. He understands that when Washington says, I want this done, Hamilton does it, and he doesn't have to run it by the boss. He can just send this letter and Washington will glance over it and read it. So here he is. Here's Lafayette again. The other man is this gentleman. This is Baron von Steuben, who claimed that he knew Frederick the Great of Austria. Now, if you want to model your army with discipline, you emulate the Prussian army. It's a lie. In fact, all of his credentials are probably a lie. He may have been maybe a junior officer, but he came to train Americans on how to fight. And that's what happened at the Valley Forge encampment. He took small companies of soldiers, 20, 30 men, and he taught them how to drill and fire as a unit and how to maneuver. The Americans, you'd not be surprised, don't understand that in the European style of being a soldier, you are an automaton. You're broken down to simply take orders. Do this. Okay, I will. Do that. Okay. When he tells the soldiers to do something, there's a hand raised or something. I don't know. I can just imagine it happening in this small group of soldiers like this. They ask him why. Why do we have to do that? And he couldn't curse in English. He learned to curse in English, calling the Americans a bunch of goddamn pig farmers and other things like that. But that's after a while. So you would have this spew of profanities in several different languages that were not in English that then had to be translated from, in many cases, Prussian, German to French, and then later to English. And while this was all happening, the troops laughed their tricorn hats off, let's just say, watching this man kind of stomp in the snow and just curse out these soldiers. So they laughed at him at first, and then they listened. Because from this corps of company of soldiers, that he took the traditional manual of arms from Europe. I mean, this is shoulder arms, this is trail arms, this is, again, all the steps by which you need to load and fire a gun. And remember, you don't throw a clip into a gun and blast away. You have to load every single shot into an 18th century musket, while people within sight of you are shooting at you. This isn't press a button video game, drones, missiles, and all that kind of stuff, long-range artillery. I've said that war is very personal because you all have at the end of your gun a foot-long stake by which you drive into your enemy. It's a bayonet. So you have to be good with, again, loading and firing very quickly and maintaining discipline. The other part of the Valley Forge encampment that started was that, let me go back here. Here we go. They started Washington, and he insisted on giving inoculations to smallpox. Part of the Valley Forge encampment that we didn't know a lot about, and we're studied more in the last recent years. I think I mentioned before there was a smallpox epidemic. Really, it's a pandemic. I mean, it crosses international lines. In 1777 and 1778, hit the American South a little bit later, with devastating results in some Native American nations. So what you would do if you start inoculations, which are controversial, and they were once again developed by an African man during the century before. It was the idea that you were going to get a weakened version of the smallpox inside your own body, and you would then be able to fight it off. So this is a recreation, obviously, of a smallpox ward. in the Continental Army. So he didn't want the British to know that he was going through this, because he would set part of the army to the side. And so they would get the inoculations. They literally would find someone who was sick, like these gentlemen who were on the cots, and they would scratch the corpuscles you would get from smallpox. And then, okay, and then they would just make sure that a healthy person got it. And that's all we're going to say about that.
But that's not a lesser version. That is just them like giving the people a stronger smallpox.
Yeah, but getting it that way versus just contracting it through contact, the thought was it was going to be a less powerful strain that hopefully you would be able to, since you were healthy then, fight it off. Or you died. I mean, there was that too. And I think you're always taking a risk with an army that is going through not only cold weather. Yes, it was cold. No, it wasn't super snowy, but malnutrition. Imagine the army was hungry a lot. And it was hungry because they didn't have a good supply system. And then you were risking them by saying, we're going to give them, this on top of it. Washington, by January of 1778, 1779. We're right, 1778. I'm sorry. The Valley Forge winter, 1777, 1778. There we go. So January 1778, he believes he has about 8,000 soldiers fit for duty. So the smallpox inoculations did help. They also started to get fed better. The horrible system of supply eventually improved, and it took until the beginning of 1778 for that to actually happen. The weather alone was not the problem. We know that about 2,500 soldiers died at Valley Forge. That's a shocking number. In an encampment now, if we had a modern equivalent, that would just be completely untenable, and that would be very, very controversial. So exposure and hunger were the main culprits to those that died. Weather, not so much. The next winter in New Jersey, in Morristown, when the Army goes back to that same encampment, the snow doesn't melt until May. So what Valley Forge looks like Club Med, compared to the next winter in upstate New Jersey. The Army Washington takes into battle in 1778 is also a different force. The makeup of the soldiers, as I said before, is beginning to dramatically change. They're not farmers, volunteers, and bright-eyed enthusiasts of 1775. These folks are staying home. They are third and fourth sons with little prospects. Big brother's going to inherit a lot of land. That's the law in my state. May as well join up to get that 100 acres. They're down on their luck artisans. And they're black men. They joined the Continental Army. 1/5, we think, of Washington's army was African American. Upwards of 5,000 black men serve in the Continental Army. The sad part of the story is, of course, that this will be the last integrated army until the Korean War. Yeah, every army after that is segregated. War of 1812, Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, until President Truman desegregates the armed forces. Some states obviously were told, look, you have to fill your quota. Rhode Island said our quota is made up of folks in our state who are African Americans who completely fill the roles of two Rhode Island regiments. Valley Forge became almost a badge of honor for the officers and enlisted men who lived through it. The following summer, as the British decide they're going to abandon Philadelphia, return most of their army to New York. Why is this happening? Well, we'll get into actually more of the details with the British Southern strategy in 1778. But what also happens is that it makes a lot of sense. Let me show you a couple of uniforms. This is interesting. Yeah, the Rhode Island Regiment. You can see this gentleman wearing the particular uniform. African-American gentleman who's wearing the rather unique infantry uniform of that state. They chose to put, obviously, that anchor there on their kind of shortened helmet. You can see here's a Virginia regiment. The uniforms were different. And now we see a New York regiment. Again, most of the Continental Army had blue uniforms, but sometimes their artillery were made of red facings or red uniforms with blue facings, just to confuse things even more. So it's a hodgepodge of uniforms, as it is a hodgepodge of an army. So getting back to what took place in 1778, with the British having to change their strategy because of the French alliance, the commander of the British soldiers in Philadelphia decides he's going to go by land. Remember, they left New York and went to Philadelphia the year before by sea. Left, came up the Chesapeake Bay, up into the Delaware River. This time they're going to go over land. Washington sees that from his spy network, which is becoming pretty successful by 1778, that he's got an opportunity to take the army that had been trained. You know, those 20, 30 soldiers who were trained by von Steuben, they go out and say, all right, we're going to train the rest of your regiment. You know, you guys who are all staying in one cabin, you teach the next group how to do it, and von Steuben will bring in another group. They fight very well. In June of 1778, in 105-degree heat in New Jersey at the Battle of Monmouth, Washington's army slugs it out with the British on a horrid afternoon where people drop dead of the heat. Nobody runs away at the Battle of Monmouth. No flank is left exposed by Washington, and Washington rides into action. This is again, glorified painting of Washington at the Battle of Monmouth. I grew up not very far from the battlefield in central New Jersey, rolling hills there. It's not the New Jersey you see on television of either. People often shocked I don't either speak like someone from the Jersey Shore or from the Sopranos, but somewhere in between, there is a pretty nice state. And this area is horse country. In the middle of New Jersey. Anyway, the armies clashed here because Washington saw that the British were withdrawing across the state of New Jersey to get from Pennsylvania to New York. Here's his opportunity. And again, pick and choose where you fight. Don't let the army get destroyed. It's usually considered a draw because Washington beats up the army there. The British continue their movement, not retreat, they would say, back into New York City. But again, it's fairly successful for a number of reasons. Okay, so there you have it, the Battle of Monmouth. There's another great story at the Battle of Monmouth. Any of you familiar with Molly Pitcher? Molly Hayes, Mary Hayes, she goes by different names. We know that she jumped in and operated an artillery battery when the gentleman on the ground, her husband, basically keeled over from heat stroke, heat exhaustion. Again, it will get warm in New Jersey. I lived through some of those summers, but 105 degrees, maybe one of the hottest on record. When he falls, Molly Pitcher, and that became a name for women in the army afterwards who carried water. You don't only needed water to give to the gun crews to cool off. You needed water too, as you can see what she's doing here. Molly Pitcher is swabbing the inside of the cannon to make sure with something that looks like a giant Q-tip, and she would have dipped that into water. So you want to make sure that the cannon that you're about to reload, none of the sparks from the previous round you fired are still alive in there. Because if you put that next projectile in, whatever you're shooting, in a cannon you can shoot a solid cannonball. You can also shoot something that looks like an oversized shotgun round, where you have small 10-12. It's called grape shot. I mean, or you can pour sand or rocks or glass. You know, you can fire anything as long as you get the thing to fire. So she will be now pushing that all the way to the back of that cannon, twisting it, coming back out like you clean your ear, I guess, and reloading. And so the gentlemen there were like, what's going on? She said, look, just keep going, guys. Tell me what to do. She obviously saw enough of what had to be done. And the legend of Molly Pitcher at the Battle of Monmouth is born. Later on, through support and applications of her own, she was given a military pension, $40 a year. Molly Pitcher. Mary Hayes, she goes by different names we don't even necessarily know, but she did put in the application as veterans did in the aftermath of the war so that Congress would pay them as a combat veteran. One cannonball fired in their direction carried away part of her petticoat. She looked at the gentleman and said, "What? I mean, if it had gone higher, it would have been a lot worse, but let's keep on going here." And they're like, "Okay." You know, they keep loading the cannon, and it just, again, it's one of the interesting stories of the Battle of Monmouth. Again, Washington was able to take the army trained after Valley Forge into battle, and they did pretty good. They don't really fight much after that. This is really it's one of the biggest battles in the American Revolution. It lasts one day, and then after that, he doesn't really take the army into battle until the really end. The campaign is going to change more into the South, obviously, but more than anything else, Washington is just keeping an eye on the British army that's going to remain, for the most part, in New York. Okay, so between the campaigns, as we have to talk about always when we're discussing the social developments that take place, John Adams said the real revolution happened when you have the state constitutions replacing the old colonial charters. So the American revolutionaries were really good at overthrowing the governments of the king. They closed the courts, again, the shadow governments during the insurgency. They drove royal agents out of office. They elected new men to these extra legal assemblies. When the official government was shut down by the governor or other officials, they just kept going. Throwing off the king's representatives was only one part of the challenge. The next part is to run the colony in a rebellion and now form a new state constitution. And this is where John Adams thinks the real revolution happens. It happens when the states write new charters. Adams at the time did not suggest what kind of government each state should make. So Congress tells the states, write a state constitution. And some come back, what kind? And they're like, a new kind. Adams later says, I regret we didn't have congressional direction on what kind of state constitutions they wrote, because some of them, Pennsylvania, was crazy with some of the ideas that they came up with. We are used to, in our modern sensibilities, a one-size-fits-all, top-down. Congress says, the states follow. Not this way, not at all. Remember, these colonies, now states, all have their individual backstories, founded by different groups at different times, in some cases by folks who were not mostly English, the Dutch. The real revolution happens writing the state constitutions. The real concern in late 1775 and 1776 is for everyone to back independence. That is the struggle. So this took a back seat, the idea of writing a new state constitution. States, now that independence is declared in July, they have a free hand at creating new governments. The only problem is they have no experience in doing so. So what kind of governments do we get? I will highlight some of them, and then we'll talk about the creation of the all-important first national constitution. Most of the fellow delegates, including John and his cousin Sam, only Sam, not John in this case. Most of the delegates, including Samuel Adams, not John, but Samuel, because John says something else, favor a one-house assembly, unicameral as it's called. Obviously today in Congress we are a bicameral legislature, as we are in the Louisiana legislature as well. John Adams thinks a unicameral government is horrible. He calls it a juvenile approach to government. But he kept his mouth shut. He tried to advise what his home state of Massachusetts did, with some success. It took about 5 years for all of the governments to be in place, from 1776 up through 1781. And it shows a strong divide in each of the states. Some states get started early. New Hampshire has their plan up and running in 1776. By the time of the Declaration of Independence, 4 states have written new frameworks for government. They'd written the framework for government because I think mostly they are pretty strongly in support of independence. You have to consider that what's happening in late 1775, early 1776 is you've got these congressional delegations and you've got people within the state debating whether or not they are going to be in favor of independence or reconciliation. So forming a new government is priority 2. 1 is making that decision, up or down on independence. So if you're early on in support of independence, step 2, write the Constitution. That's why we have this flurry of activity, and then 4 or 5 states writing these new governments. That no 2 constitutions have the same or look the same should not be a surprise, because no 2 states have the same history. Maryland and Pennsylvania, for example, have almost 1/3 of the population enslaved. In Maryland, Pennsylvania, it is more about 4%. The religion is also different. So slavery will matter. Slavery will matter when it comes to property distribution and establishing that in the National Congress. In Maryland, the slave-owning planters drafted a constitution and made their influence overwhelming. How revolutionary is the revolution? Not so much in Maryland. It's kind of replacing the people who are in charge who are English with the people who are in charge who are American. Pennsylvania, different story. You have middling farmers, city artisans, doctors, teachers, and they produce radical change in their state government. This is the kind that worries John Adams a lot. Pennsylvania throws open the vote to all tax-paying men age 21. The property qualification is gone? Wow. If you paid a tax, more than likely a poll tax, you voted. You didn't necessarily have to be a property owner. You know, to own property means you're invested in society. And so that's why you get to vote. That's why those who don't own property have no vote. Indentured servants, slaves, youngsters, women, because they are technically, by the definition of the time, dependent on someone else. That's why they are not given the franchise or the right to vote. The only qualification in Pennsylvania was that you had to swear allegiance to the revolutionary movement and pay a tax, and you vote. This made the drafting committee and those who voted for independence committed to the cause in 1776. Their product, the Pennsylvania Constitution, has to be considered the most liberal constitution in the world. It threw out a lot of conventions of how you should and how the rule book is for developing a state government. Many elite in Pennsylvania, loyalist and patriot alike, are generally fearful of the final product. Clockmakers, doctors, brewers, lead this rebellion and will now be in the government. All the warnings that the loyalists had about levelers, that's the word they used, the social order would be completely flipped. It seems to be playing out in Pennsylvania. They create one assembly, a unicameral assembly. They do not create an office of governor in Pennsylvania. They allow all free men to vote. They impose term limits on those who serve in the legislature. A council is created to review the legality of legislation, and they have regular reapportionment, meaning if the population moves from east to west, north to south, they will go and redraw the counties and have the representation or add new counties.
So they were trying to make everyone happy.
Yeah, this was a complaint amongst people, especially, remember the regulation in North Carolina? What they would do is have like 30 counties in the east and 2 in the west. And then they say, okay, we need another county. So like, okay, we'll take the big county, Orange County in North Carolina, where Salisbury and Winston-Salem, and we'll just cut that in half. And so now you have 2 representatives from Giant County and 2 representatives from the other half of Giant County. And the people in the west were saying, yeah, but most people live out here. You need to subdivide these counties. And then the folks in the east said, yeah, but the more people live there, the more weak we become in the east. We have a monopoly of the government. We have the votes in each of these multiple counties, and you have, 4 western counties. We like it that way. And the folks in the west said, we don't like it that way. And so this is a complaint, independent of the constitutional struggle with Great Britain. This is what folks in these different states are talking about. In South Carolina, it's the lack of authority. In North Carolina, it's multiple office holders, and a lack of representation, as far as a lack of reapportionment. And Pennsylvania promises that's going to be different in their case. John Adams spoke for many in the colonies after he got a copy of the Pennsylvania Constitution. You can't beat John Adams's quote as usual. Good God, he says, the people of Pennsylvania in 2 years will be glad to petition the crown of Britain for reconciliation in order to be delivered from the tyranny of their Constitution. Unquote. There's John Adams. John Adams wrote a whole history of not only the constitutions of the United States, but he was giving advice on what he thought was the best constitutions throughout world history. And he just thought that a unicameral legislature was not the way to go. It just invites the democratic forces being a bad concept in 1777, in, and you wouldn't have wise, intelligent, proper gentlemen governing the colony. Athens and Rome were ruined by letting unpropertied citizens participate in the process. That's why democracy is a four-letter word in the 1770s. Adams is also hearing from his wife to make matters worse. In the new charter of government, she said, don't forget the ladies. Adams is like, ugh, you know, in his, again, receding hairline, he's trying to pull his hair out. We're going to get to how women do vote in American states in the 1770s, and oversight by the men who write the Constitution. Massachusetts follows Pennsylvania, write a state constitution, then they revise it because Adams is like, this is an invitation to chaos. No, not my state, not my state. And it turns out to be the case that they have to revise it. So some states write more than one constitution during the American Revolution. Only two other states, Virginia and Delaware, did the writers retain the old colonial property qualifications. Vermont, which at the time was trying to break free, Vermont is not a state. Vermont will become the 14th of the American Revolution, but Vermont, counties of New York. Now, we talked about Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen is a thorn in the side of the people of New York because he's essentially leading a secession movement of Vermont before the revolution happens. That's what the goal of the Green Mountain Boys had been throughout the 1770s. So in an effort to break free of New York and to convince the people who live in the Vermont counties to break free and support that idea, in Vermont, they simply allow all adult males the right to vote. No oath of allegiance, no paying a tax. Adult males vote. Other changes abounded in Vermont. You know, you change the democratic process and make it more democratic to appeal to people to move there. This is why the states after the American Revolution dropped the property qualifications and said, you know what? The legislature doesn't have to choose the electors for president. The people should. And everyone who's living in Georgia says, yeah, moving to Alabama or Mississippi may not be such a bad idea, or from Pennsylvania to Ohio or Illinois, because they've liberalized the voting process. Why not? It's a recruiting tool. Taxes are lower too. The land is cheaper. That's another reason that you can lure people over. Okay. Vermont makes judges elective offices. What? They democratize judgeships. Again, we have that now. Some are appointed, some are elected. It also outlawed slavery at the age of 21. It would simply age out slaves in the state, if it ever became a state. Contrast this to New York. New York has a powerful governor with a veto power. There is no governor in Pennsylvania. There is a high property qualification in New York. They don't want to see radical change unfold. When Vermonters compare, and technically they're trying to set up their own version of government, it's obvious that it can get support of a lot of people in the Vermont colony or counties, and it makes it more necessary to break away from New York. If New York has its way, it's going to impose its constitution on us, and we don't want that. It gets crazier in New Jersey. They write that all freeholders and housekeepers worth 50 pounds can vote. Whoopsie! They forgot to put any reference to gender in New Jersey. Well, women can read in New Jersey. Previous to this new state constitution, they couldn't vote. And so widows paying taxes have the equal right to vote if they have the same amount of property. Now, there's in the colonies a law that what you have as a woman entering a marriage technically becomes your husband. It's the concept of coverage, essentially, they call it. But if you can separate your property from your husband's property and it is worth a certain amount, you can vote. If your husband dies, you're a widow with his property. It goes to you, only to be lost again if you were to remarry or would to will it to your children. From 1776 to 1807, when the wording of the Constitution is corrected, New Jersey remains the only state allowing female suffrage. And then the folks who run the state said, nah, we're going to change the law. The other development that people did not foresee in this new constitution making was that the property qualification did not bar free men of color from voting. I have the requisite amount of property. I am a black man. You vote. Massachusetts tried to change that regulation in their constitution. One town said, don't do it. Changing perspectives here. Revolutionary change is happening in some areas, not all. And sometimes it's a window, in the case of women voting in New Jersey, that closes up. But how long is that? That's almost 30 years. 30. Congress first contemplated independence. Their priority was a foreign alliance and then a framework of government. And then get everybody on board, obviously, with supporting independence. They also understand from the get-go that they have to have a stable government necessary to defeat Great Britain. And that government had to be endorsed by all of the states. That's where I'm going to leave things today. An introduction on the first Constitution of the United States. We call it the Articles of Confederation. It took several years to go into effect for reasons that I'll discuss next time. And it's written by a man who did not favor independence, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. So what did the first Constitution look like? Where was it strong? Where was it weak? But keep this in mind before we get into the details talking about it next week. It is a statement of the people who wrote it. Government should be distrusted. Centralized power equals tyranny. Government is an unnecessary force, one that we have to have, but it can very quickly spiral out of control and deny you your rights and liberties. So it's going to be very clear what the government at the national level, the Congress, can do and what it can't do. The Articles of Confederation forms, and this is a direct quote from the actual document, a firm league of friendship is how they describe this. A firm league of friendship. You're taking on Great Britain. So is a firm league of friendship going to be enough? Power in the 1770s resides in the states, not at the national government. It creates a one-branch government without an executive branch in the form of a president, without a court system. You might see things, documents of the war signed president. That's the president of the Congress. The Congress meets, and as a group, they will choose one of their own as a president of Congress. That early president, people like John Hancock, serves early as a president of Congress, and he has correspondence with, of course, Washington and other officers. Okay, so next time we'll pick up the story of the drafting of and the passing of the Articles of Confederation and continue going back between the campaigns themselves and some of the changes that are happening, well, we might say beyond the campaigns in traditional areas that we hadn't really thought about about what's happening in the United States during the revolution itself. Okay.